Good afternoon and happy Tuesday. Today is Tuesday, December 1st, which is also hashtag Giving Tuesday for all of us here at the Illinois Science and Technology Institute. My name is Becky Goldberg. I'm one of the program managers at ISTI. ISTI is a STEM education-focused nonprofit located in Chicago, but serving students across Illinois. We are so excited to mark the event of Giving Tuesday today with our first ever virtual career fair. We are featuring innovators and innovation from all over the nation, proving the fact that innovation is not confined to any sort of space. It is about the people behind it, making new ideas come to life. I'm so excited to be joined today by genetic counselor Dena Goldberg, also my sister, so a little special shout out, who will be brought on in just a moment. I do want to take a moment to talk to all of you about Giving Tuesday for ISTI specifically. Our mission is to broaden the definition of what STEM means to our students, increasing their identity and awareness of opportunities that lie both locally and nationally. Our goal can only be met by providing access through something like school scholarships and additional programming. This comes from your donations. With your donations, if you're interested, please find them in the comment section. There's a link there that will be there momentarily where you can navigate to our donations page and go ahead and give today in honor of Giving Tuesday. So without much further ado, I'm going to pull in Dena as she joins us. Again, this is Dena Goldberg, genetic counselor. Dena, how are you today?
Hi, I'm good. How are you?
I'm good. We're so excited to have you joining us all the way from California. So hopefully you'll bring some of that sunshine onto our screen, and I will turn it over to you pretty quickly to learn more about your STEM path.
Great, thank you. All right, well, hello everyone. I'm very excited to talk to you today about my pathway through science as the S in STEM. So I am Dena Goldberg. I'm a licensed and board certified genetic counselor. This is me. And today, like I said, we're going to talk about my path. Now, I really like this photo because I like to take the road less traveled. And when we think about people that are interested in biology or pre-med, many of them go on to try and become doctors or nurses, but there are a lot of other professions that are also available, including genetic counseling. So genetic counseling is kind of like this road less traveled. Now, before I begin, I want to let all of you know that my brain is basically a mixture of these three things: science, art, and media. So I'm going to show you how I've been able to combine these three things in my career. So why am I in genetics? Well, it all stems from my little sister. I have two younger sisters. The youngest one, when she was born, was diagnosed with a chromosome abnormality. And you can see here a picture of her chromosomes. And on the 18th chromosome, one of them is missing both ends. And so it forms a ring. The ends stick together. And that means that she's missing a lot of genes on that chromosome. So this is us, that's her growing up, and this was us most recently. And so Ellie, my sister, is my inspiration for loving genetics and becoming interested in it. And the Chromosome 18 Research and Registry Society is the organization that really pushed me to become a genetic counselor and showed me how helpful I could be by entering this career. So shout out to them. So I began my studies at the University of Illinois in the School of Integrative Biology. So my bachelor's degree is in integrative biology, and it was a wonderful experience. When I was in undergrad, I really wanted to work in genetics, and there wasn't a genetics major. IB was housed genetics. And so I found the one laboratory that was doing human genetics research, and I approached Dr. Molly and asked if I could work in the laboratory. And he let me know that there weren't any jobs available, but I could intern for the summer. So I did that, and I ended up not only loving it and loving the lab, but also really I was able to sequence more than they had expected. And so we were working on human mitochondrial DNA, which is DNA that comes from a different part of the cell than where we typically see it in the nucleus. And so we were looking at Native American migration patterns through the Beringian land strait, and his lab was able to show how humans migrated and populated the Americas. So it was really interesting. It was more ancestry. It wasn't medical genetics. But I ended up, after that summer, getting offered a job there, and I worked there for the next 3 years. And this is us at one of the national anthropology conventions. So that was my start in genetics. It was in ancestry genetics. So I have a few tips for anybody that's interested in a science career. And one of them is when you're an undergraduate, it is really, really helpful to work in a laboratory. And that can be in any area doing anything, but it helps so much. And it also helps you build relationships with scientists that will help you later on in your career as well. So that's a big thing that I'd recommend, is trying to find a job in any laboratory in undergrad. So in undergrad, I also had this amazing opportunity to work with the Ceiba Foundation for Tropical Conservation, where I was able to study abroad in Ecuador. I chose Ecuador because I love genetics. And where did the theory of evolution come from? Well, Darwin and the Galapagos Islands. So I got to live in the Galapagos as a student and work with researchers. I also lived in the Amazon, the Andes, and all over Ecuador on the coast. So here are some photos, and it was by far the coolest thing I've ever done. And so my second tip is that STEM jobs can take you on adventures. You just have to look for them. So I know a lot of people who have been able to travel the world because of their STEM job, and they otherwise would never have been able to do that. So these jobs can really help you go far and see the world. So after undergrad, after graduating, I decided I wanted to get out of the Chicago winter. So I took a random job in San Francisco at University of California, San Francisco, which is an excellent cancer research center and hospital. And I was working as a laboratory technician at a breast cancer research lab, where I was doing things like counting cells and tissue culture. And that really wasn't for me. I needed to see people. I needed to talk to people. So tip number 3 is to take opportunities to try different jobs, because you're bound to dislike at least one of them, and that will help you decide on what you do like and what is right for you. So after that, I was like, I need to see patients, and I realized that genetic counseling was what I wanted to do. So I applied and got in and attended the University of California, Irvine graduate program in genetic counseling, and I graduated in 2015. And while I was there, I actually, using my art and media, was creating comics to teach about genetics, and I started a Twitter, and that got me a lot of recognition. Now, when it came time to raise money for my thesis project, I applied for some grants and I didn't get any of them. So I decided to do some crowdfunding using Indiegogo, and I was able to raise 4 times more, actually 5 times more than what the grant was originally worth. And this was all donations from genetic counselors across the country that I had never met. And this was all because of using social media and my love of art to be able to raise this money. And that allowed me to do my thesis project, which was on measuring people's awareness and misconceptions surrounding genetic counseling, and also how to use television to educate. And during grad school, I was also an intern at a lab called Ambry Genetics, where I worked with their marketing department and helped them create visual aids for other genetic counselors to use. So here's an example of one of the hearts, or the hearts for the visual aid that I created. And after I graduated grad school, I took my boards, I got my certification, and then I was hired on at University of California, San Francisco in the Cancer Genetics and Prevention program, where I was a clinical cancer genetic counselor. And I also worked with a lab called Color Genomics. And so I was working with both. I was doing industry and clinic. And I realized that I had really, really liked clinic. That was where I wanted to be. So a year later, I started doing clinic full-time. And then in 2017, I was promoted to the Gordon and Betty Moore Endowed Counselor of Hereditary Gastrointestinal Cancer Prevention. So basically, I was the go-to genetic counselor for all of the gastrointestinal hereditary cancer syndromes. So before I go on, I'm sure most of you are thinking, what is a genetic counselor? And even if you think you know, you may not fully be able to describe it or understand it. So I'm going to go through that with you right now. So what I like to explain is that most doctors and other healthcare providers, they really only get very basic training in genetics in medical school, if any at all. And genetics is always changing. It is so quickly evolving. And so it's really hard for your doctors to stay on top of that. And genetics is the future of personalized medicine. And any healthcare team working with genetics really needs someone who understands that ever-changing field of clinical genetics. So that's where the role of a genetic counselor comes in. Genetic counselors not only stay up to date on research, they translate complex information to patients, they communicate with healthcare teams, and they're trained to deliver these things in a way that is most ethical and psychologically helpful for the family. Now, genetic counselors can practice in many different areas. It started out in prenatal, so most people, when they think of genetic counseling, they think of having babies, and that is part of it. But there's also pediatric, and this is where you may have a child that has a condition and you don't know what it is, or they have a whole bunch of medical issues and no one knows why. A genetic counselor can help diagnose that. A genetic counselor in cancer genetics helps, and I'm going to explain a real-world example in a little bit with cancer. There's also genetic counselors working in cardiovascular clinics with cardiologists and people with inherited cardio diseases. And then in the neurogenetics clinic as well with things like dementia or other sort of neurodegenerative conditions. And then there's genetic counselors working in ART, which is assistive reproductive technology. And I'm going to go through that a little bit as well. And then they're working in other areas too, like psychiatric genetic counseling and many, many more. So these are just some examples of the most common. And a lot of people, when they think of genetic counseling, people assume that it's a new field because genetics is really recently really blown up, but it's actually not new. In 1947, the term genetic counseling was coined by Sheldon Reed, and in the 1960s, genetic counseling became one of the key components of clinical genetics, and then the importance of the psychological aspect of it became recognized and added. And in 1969, the first master's degree program was founded at Sarah Lawrence. And in 1979, the NSGC, or the National Society of Genetic Counselors, was founded. And then the certification of genetic counselors began in 1981, which was the board certification. So that made sure that if someone used the term genetic counselor, that they were board certified in genetic counseling. And then the American Board of Genetic Counseling is what board certifies people today, and that was in 1993. So as you can see, this is actually a decades-old profession, but there has been an exponential growth in genetic counseling over recent years. So how do you become a genetic counselor? Well, it requires a 4-year bachelor's degree. And typically people have a bachelor's degree in something like biology, genetics, psychology, or something related, but you don't have to. A lot of programs take people who have something completely unrelated as long as you have the prerequisites. So you can major in anything, you just have to have the prerequisites. And many students actually come from another career. So maybe they were a teacher, a social worker, a nurse, or a researcher, and they decide that they want to be a genetic counselor, and that happens frequently. So we'll get PhD students that are now going back to get a master's so they can be a genetic counselor. And then the second step is the master's degree in genetic counseling. And as of now, there are 51 programs in the United States. When I applied about 8 years ago, there were only 30. So that number is growing very quickly. And there's 4 in Canada. And the programs include clinical rotations, coursework, logging cases, and then a big master's thesis or capstone project. So once you have your master's in genetic counseling, then you have to sit for the board exam through the American Board of Genetic Counseling. And once you pass that, you get the CGC behind your name. So that's what's behind my name there. And the L in my name is my state license. So it depends on the state. Not every state has licensure, but in California, where I practice, you have to have the license. So that's where the MS is my master's, the L is the license, CGC is my board certification. That's how a person would become a genetic counselor. So now I'm excited to give you a real world example of how genetic counselors solve medical mysteries and prevent disease. So meet Mike. Mike is a 44-year-old healthy male. Now, Mike has been having some issues going to the bathroom, so he consults his doctor, and the doctor recommends he gets a colonoscopy. Now, during his colonoscopy, the doctor finds a mass, and unfortunately, the mass comes back to be colon cancer. So Mike now is diagnosed with colon cancer. Mike keeps thinking about this and thinking, how did this happen? He's so healthy. He exercises, he eats well. He just can't think of what he did to cause this colon cancer. Well, luckily, the doctors realize that Mike is young for having colon cancer, so they refer him to a genetic counselor. When he goes to meet with the genetic counselor, the first thing she does is collect a family history. And so we're going to go through that right now. So this is a pedigree, what I'm about to show you. This is a tool that we use to collect people's family history and recognize patterns. So for all of you out there who like puzzles, this is a big part of the job, is solving puzzles. So just so you know, the squares are biological males and the circles are biological females. So this is Mike, our patient here who was diagnosed with colon cancer at 44. Mike has two daughters, Britta and Annie, who are young adults. He has a brother who has a son and his parents. Now, when the genetic counselor collects his parents, she realizes that his mother actually had a uterine cancer at 47. So upon further history, they find out that he actually had an aunt who passed away from ovarian cancer. And also that Mike's grandfather's sister had colon cancer as well. So now that we see this laid out, we can see this pattern of 3 generations of cancers, and they're cancers that go together with certain syndromes. So this is Mike's family history. This is his pedigree. Now the genetic counselor, after going through this, explains to Mike that the way that we can detect what's running in the family and causing cancers is by doing a simple saliva or blood test. Mike decides to do saliva, so he consents and he spits in a tube, and the genetic counselor sends it off to the laboratory. And 2 weeks go by, and Mike comes back for his results. Now, the genetic counselor then discloses that a pathogenic variant, which is also another word for mutation, was detected in a gene called MLH1. And this gene, MLH1, is associated with something called Lynch syndrome. This means that Mike now is diagnosed with Lynch syndrome. Now, what does that mean for him? So Lynch syndrome, caused by MLH1, means that if somebody has this mutation, they have a lifetime risk of about 52 to 82% for colon cancer, and then 25 to 60% of uterine cancer. There's also stomach cancer, ovarian cancer, and several other cancer risks. So what we do when we know someone has this is we focus in on what they're at really high risk for, and we figure out how we can prevent those cancers. So Mike, and the other thing too is knowing that somebody has Lynch syndrome or one of these syndromes actually changes their cancer treatment. So because we know that Mike has Lynch syndrome, he can now go on something called immunotherapy instead of using just the standard chemotherapy to treat his cancer. The surgery is also different when someone has Lynch syndrome versus when they don't. So this genetic testing actually informed his oncologist and changed his treatment. Now, how does Lynch syndrome get passed down? Well, in every cell in our body, we have 20,000 different genes, over 20,000. And we have 2 copies of every gene. We get 1 copy of every gene from mom and 1 copy from dad. So this is how inheritance works. Now, when one of our parents has a mutated gene or a faulty gene, then we don't know which one will get passed down because we know it's going to be one or the other. It's a 50-50 chance. So it's a 50% chance that a person inherits this faulty gene, but it's also a 50% chance that they inherit the normal copy of this gene. So that means from all of Mike's children, they have a 50% chance of inheriting Lynch syndrome. And so what does this mean now? So this is now Mike's pedigree. And we know now that his daughters are at a 50% chance, but also his brother. We know that this came from one of his parents, and we're assuming it's from the one who had the uterine cancer and the cancer history. So we know his brother also has a 50% chance. So let's see what happens next. So Mike brings his daughters in to see the genetic counselor, And the genetic counselor explains Lynch syndrome to them and what it would mean to test, and they both consent and give their saliva. Now, 2 weeks go by, and Britta finds out that she's actually positive for Lynch syndrome, and Annie tests negative. So Britta goes in and talks to the genetic counselor about what that means for her, and Annie does the same thing. Now, these are two very different sessions because one of them is positive, one is negative. And then Mike's brother Joe has testing as well for this family mutation, and he is found to be positive. Because he's positive, the recommendation is that he gets a colonoscopy now at 41 instead of at 50, which is when most people get it. So Joe, Mike's brother, goes in for a colonoscopy, and the doctor actually finds a precancerous polyp that, if it had been left in, would have become cancer. But because we know that he had this higher risk, we were able to go in, and the doctor was able to take out the polyp before it could become cancer. And so this is an example of how genetic testing can help prevent cancer. So then we test Pierce, and we find out that he's negative, which is good news. And then we look at the rest of the family. So we can tell that this, with the pluses, is most likely the way that this mutation was passed down in this family. And when someone is negative, they cannot pass it to children, so we don't need to test Eric's children here. So what does this mean for Britta and Annie? Well, Britta is the one that has MLH1 Lynch syndrome. So she now needs to have colonoscopy every 1 to 2 years, starting at age 25, and she needs to have uterine cancer surveillance. And then when she's done having children, the recommendation is to remove the uterus and ovaries to prevent uterine and ovarian cancer, because those are cancers that are very hard to screen for, and it's much easier when you are done having children to be able to remove those organs. There's also medications for prevention. And then we have Annie, who's a true negative, meaning we know what the family mutation is and we know she didn't inherit it. So her screening is colonoscopy at 50 every 10 years and normal gynecological exams. This is what the general population gets. So you can see how these two sisters have very different recommendations and very different personalized screening plans, which we would not have known if their father had never been tested for Lynch syndrome. Now, that's an example of what it would look like for a family to come into the cancer genetics clinic. So that's what the work that I did at UCSF. Now, another clinic would be prenatal or preconception. So let's say that Britta, who has Lynch syndrome, let's say 7 years later, she and her husband are thinking of having a child, but she really doesn't want to give her child Lynch syndrome. Well, there are options to prevent passing down a condition. When we know what the mutation is for a condition, we can actually do something called in vitro fertilization with pre-implantation genetic diagnosis. And what this means is an embryo of Britta and her husband can be created, or they can create several embryos from their egg and sperm. And the embryos are then grown out in a lab, and then there's one cell is removed from each of them and tested to see if that embryo has Lynch syndrome. And then the embryos that do not have Lynch syndrome are the ones that will be implanted. So it's a way of ensuring that Britta will never pass down Lynch syndrome to her children, and that the Lynch syndrome in this family will stop with her, because if you don't have it, you can't pass it down. So this is another way that genetic counseling and some of the genetic technology can prevent disease. And that can work with any genetic condition that we know the mutation for. So that's an example of what the work that a genetic counselor would do. So going back to what I did in my clinic, so not only was I seeing patients, but I also had the opportunity to participate in research, and I had several publications as well, and this is just a list of some of them, and I've presented at many conferences about the research that I did. So it's not just clinic, it's also research. You can do research as a genetic counselor. I was also the NSGC, the National Society of Genetic Counselors, Marketing and Communications Workgroup Chair, where I helped them create their patient-facing site using some of my skills with social media and graphic design. And I also participated in the first ever Genetic Counseling Awareness Day and created the official shirt for that. So not science related, but I could use my artistic skills in the science field. So What now? So after being in my clinical role for many years, I decided that because I have kind of an entrepreneurial mind, I wanted to create some sort of way to combine media and science. So I created my personal brand called Dena DNA. And what I do is I do things like graphic design. I've created workbooks. I've created comics for different companies, and I create awareness videos and campaigns. And so this is just some of my work. And I also have a web series that I encourage all of you to check out. And this is my series where I have videos that are only a few minutes long that explain really complicated topics. And I use my animation skills and illustrating skills to explain these topics. And it is very easy to understand for people who are interested in genetic testing. I also had the opportunity to be the genetic counselor as part of the American Colleges of Obstetrics and Gynecology's continuing medical education. And I also had the opportunity to speak with Planned Parenthood about abortions and genetic counseling and how we view it from a genetic counselor's view. So these are two opportunities that I had right before COVID, and then COVID happened. So now I'm really focusing more on my online presence. I also worked on a political campaign. So there are genetic counselors that also work in politics as well, because there are a lot of laws that affect our patients and the way that we practice. So how do I finance my videos? I also have a store, and this is kind of my fun side hustle where I design genetics themed apparel, and people can buy this as gifts. And it's kind of a niche market that's not super big, but it's big enough that I do have, some customers, or a good amount. And I'm also very active on social media, and I'm trying to grow my presence. So if you want to support me, it would help me a lot if you could give me a follow on one or all of these social media accounts. And currently, my newest project is working with an Academy Award winning producer, and we are developing a documentary and hopefully eventually a web series about genetics, or sorry, not a web series, a TV series about genetics and surrounding different genetics topics. So that's what I'm doing now. Now I think we can stop and let's chat. I'll take any questions at this point.
Awesome. So that was incredibly informative, both the animation of the medical side, but also how you blend in your creativity. So thank you so much for sharing. There's a lot to kind of review there. So we'll take this kind of piecemeal. One of the first questions that we'd love to hear is hearing about your background. There's a lot of that hard science, a lot of that research piece, the clinical portion, but not so much of the kind of art training or the marketing training. How have you gone about adult continuous learning to hone in on skills that you're really passionate about and then apply those to the science side?
Yeah, so YouTube is a really great resource for that. It's free, it's easy. I literally use it for everything. So if I want to learn a new software, I watch YouTube videos on it. If I want to learn a new skill, I'll watch YouTube videos. Also, Instagram has a lot of videos. There's a lot of content out there that's free that you can watch, and you could really teach yourself a lot by doing that. So that's kind of how I've learned all of the art tricks. And then there's also online classes that are free or that are very inexpensive that I've worked on for marketing, and little certifications here and there. So yeah, that's kind of how I've been working on it.
Awesome. And those are great resources, I feel like, really for anyone exploring just new spaces. I also just wanted to highlight, we heard this as a theme throughout the day of not saying no to opportunities just because they're not perfectly aligned. Given that takeaway, what was one thing that you were surprised to learn when you either worked in the lab or worked at UCSF that maybe you didn't think going in you would take it away, but you were able to kind of put it in your tool belt and walk away with it to the next adventure?
That's a good question. Yeah, I would say, well, first of all, I really didn't like, the laboratory that I worked in at first for the breast cancer research really wasn't for me at the time, but then I ended up like full circle going back and becoming a cancer genetic counselor at the same institution. And a lot of the experience I had from working in that lab actually lent itself to the work I did later in breast cancer. So I was able to speak from a different, or to see it from a different view because of the laboratory experience I had, even though I did not like the laboratory.
Excellent. So just taking those new perspectives, I really like that. You also mentioned that genetics is the future of personalized medicine. And in the education world, we hear that a lot in terms of personalized education, personalized learning. So I know you gave us a direct example with looking at the daughters of how that personalized learning really works. How does that apply kind of broader in the genetics field of, or what's the future of that personalized medicine?
Yeah. So basically, right now, when we think of anything in medicine, most of it is a one-size-fits-all approach, right? Like there are these guidelines that these major organizations put out saying everybody needs to do like the colonoscopy at 50, and every woman needs to do mammograms at 40, and everybody needs to do these things. Well, personalized medicine would make it so we now know which women are actually at an increased risk and really need to be doing mammograms at 40, but which ones can be doing it at 50 and which ones should be doing it at 30. And so anything in medicine where there's a major recommendation, it's going to become more kind of categorized and personalized, really. And this applies to every area. I'm just more familiar with cancer, that's why I'm using that as an example. But like even women when they're getting pregnant, they'll be able to use certain data points to know you're more at risk for this versus you're more at risk for that. Or like who's at risk for developing diabetes, or who will react better to a certain anxiety medicine than someone else. So all of these things, we can use genetics to figure out the risk of somebody or someone's reaction to a medication.
I like them moving away from the one size fits all. Again, I think that, as you mentioned, it's applicable in a lot of different things, whether it's in medicine or in society as a whole, how we meet the needs of every citizen, of every person, every student, every patient. So it's a wonderful perspective, again, to have us think through a new lens. Also, you mentioned this idea of ethics. So having genetics counselors kind of be up to date on what ethics means in medicine or in the genetic field. And I think that's something that could be quite unfamiliar for some of our students, even people who are not necessarily as close to a medical field or medical profession. So can you explain ethics a little more beyond just, is this ethical right or wrong? What does ethics mean in terms of genetics?
Yeah, that's a really good question. So there's situations that will come up where, let's say we do a test on a child who has autism, let's say. And the types of tests we do something called a trio sometimes, which is where you look at the mom and the dad's genetics and you look at the child's and you look at the differences. Well, let's say somebody does that test and they find out that the father is not the real father of the child. Well, now you're in this ethical dilemma of, who do you tell, or do you even tell people? Is this important? Does this affect the care of the child? And so there's a lot of situations kind of like that where you have to really think about, what is important and what is your role. And that's what ethics is. It's kind of looking at, what the right thing to do in different situations are. And you get a lot of that training in grad school. The other thing I can think of with ethics is, now that we have gene editing with something called CRISPR, where you can actually edit in and edit out parts of the DNA. And this is not something that's widely used. It's still like very much in development. But eventually, once it's developed, who's going to stop people from editing in things to make them more athletic or smarter? And it's one thing to edit out heart disease or Alzheimer's, but another thing to edit in or things that make you, a designer baby, whatever. So that is also another ethical dilemma that gets brought up. And so these are things that there are people that literally study this as a profession, is bioethics, and what is okay, what should be okay, and why it should be okay. But that's like another example of ethics.
Awesome. And then totally switching gears, more towards kind of your work and your path. As you mentioned, you like to choose the road less traveled. And I can imagine that as you broke into this industry of science and genetics in comics or in media, you mentioned it's a niche market for even kind of your clothing and items. Did you hear any pushback from either the science community or even the media community saying like, no, you can't blend these worlds? And if you did, what was your response?
Yeah, I think that there were other genetics professionals who thought I was kind of crazy. And I just kept doing it. Like, it's crazy because no one's done it. That's the only reason they think that, right? Because you're the first one doing it. But then later I would get the same people, praising me for being able to do something new. So I think it's just, if you really truly believe and you have support, like I had some really great support from some big genetic counselors, but then I'd hear pushback from other genetic counselors that I just don't think were thinking as broadly and not as out of the box as me. And I think that if you have even support from anyone and you feel you can do something, it's kind of you just have to think about that not everybody thinks the way you do. And because you think you in a unique way, you have more to bring you have different things to bring to the table.
I love that. And we at ISTI think a lot about bringing our students' full selves into their research or into their projects. And so I think you're a great model of that, is that these are the ways that your brain operates, is that you are creative and you do have that art lens and you brought that into science. And I think that's a really cool way. I'm excited that we were able to share that with our community. So as we kind of get ready to wrap up, I'd love to turn it over to you if there are any kind of last minute pieces of advice or wisdom, something that you want to share with our community.
I think I said a lot of them in the talk, but I think that I really think that it's true that STEM can bring you far. And for any girls, I think that it's different. Like now, it's so different. I think it's cool to be in STEM now, because of these big movements, and it may not have used to be. I don't remember it ever being uncool to be in science. I always thought it was cool and unique. But I think it helps to really have this mindset of that you are doing something unique and you are smart and you are going to set yourself apart from maybe other people in your situation. So whether you're female or whether you're part of a minority community, just knowing that being in STEM will not only make you that much cooler, but it also can it can give you a lot of opportunities. There are so many opportunities out there. So I don't know. I think that's the only thing I can think of right now.
No, that's great. And I love you had a slide about that too, that like STEM takes you on adventures. And we definitely have heard a lot of that today. And I think it's absolutely true. So thank you for reiterating that and really driving it home. For any of our viewers who continue to have questions for Dena, please comment either on Facebook or contact her through some of the social media channels that she has shared today. If you comment on Facebook, I will make sure that they get to Dena and that a response gets to you. If you are watching this later on, so not live recording, again, if you have questions or comments that you'd like to share with Dena, send those to an ISTI staff member and we will make sure they get to Dena. With that, Dena, I would love to just extend another big thank you from the ISTI team. Again, you're an example of what we'd like to showcase for our students, to really show that there's no one right way to be in STEM, and that it can really culminate your passions, your experiences, your skill sets, and again, set you apart. So thank you so much for being here today. And for all of our live viewers, we'll be back at 5 with our final raffle. So thank you to our donors so far. Again, the way to donate is in the comments, and we will see everyone soon.
Thank you.